Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Pope Leo has said something interesting, perhaps a little bit illuminating, maybe giving a little bit of insight into his thoughts on the traditional Latin Mass. He's given a series of interviews lately. We're getting some more meaty statements on the topic than we've received before. We're going to discuss those here and what the path would be for the liberalization of the Latin Mass. Stay tuned. Before I begin, thank you to everybody for your support and your prayers during this difficult time. I won't go into it again, but if I haven't been doing that many videos because of certain things going on. And thank you to everyone who has been so nice with all your messages and so forth. I wish I could respond to them all, but I simply just can't. And one last thing, check out Real Estate for Life. Link for that underneath. They do help to support the show. Along with iCatholic Mobile, you have a cell phone. You need your cell phone to some degree for most of you. Your kids might have phones, especially if they're off at school. Work with a Catholic company, and part of your bills that you pay actually go to helping traditional Catholic religious, which is awesome. So thank you to Real Estate for Life and iCatholic Mobile, all your real estate needs and all your mobile needs. You can click the links underneath for that. Maybe you can hear my son screaming in the background. Not screaming in a bad way, but just having fun. Okay, so what did Pope Leo say? Well, we're going to pull that up here. All right, so Pope Leo said the following. This is a portion from an interview that he gave, and this is on the traditional Latin Mass. And he said, I have already received a number of requests and letters about the traditional Latin Mass. The question about people always say the Latin Mass. Well, you can say Mass in Latin right now. If it's the Vatican II rite, there's no problem. I would like to pause there for a second. Why am I pausing there for a second? Because sometimes within liturgical scholarship, some of the commentators, they'll say, well, you know, the new Mass isn't really the Mass of Vatican II. I mean, at a certain point, personally, I think that argument has to be dropped. While it is possible to look at Sacrosanctum Concilium, the document on the liturgy from the Second Vatican Council, and say the Novus Ordo does not adequately correspond to what the document calls for, you can certainly make that argument. But Pope after Pope, since the Council, has associated the new Mass with the Council. So I don't know where else the new Mass is going to come from. And the thing about the Second Vatican Council is that there is a lot of wiggle room for interpretation. A lot of the documents, parts of the documents are very clear. There's no doubt about that. But there are certain parts within the documents that give room for a wide range of interpretations. Pope after Pope, those who were at the Council, those who have been formed since the Council, in the wake of the Council, they keep talking about the new Mass as if it corresponds to Vatican II. You might be able to find the odd thing in Ratzinger that seems to suggest something a little bit different, but pretty consistently from Paul VI to Pope Leo XIV, we have the popes talking about the new Mass being the Vatican II Mass. So take that for what it's worth. In any event, he said, between the Tridentine Mass and the Vatican II Mass, again, he says it's the Vatican II Mass twice, the Mass of Paul VI, I'm not sure where that's going to go. It's obviously very complicated. I do know that part of the issue, unfortunately, has become, again, part of a process of polarization. People have used liturgy as an excuse for advancing other topics, and that's true. I mean, you could make the argument that that has happened in a bad way, from both sides of the spectrum, quite frankly. I can't really think of examples where traditionalists have tried to push things that don't have anything to do with Catholicism. But I don't know. I'm trying to give benefit of the doubt here. It's become a political tool, and that's very unfortunate. He's right about that. The new Mass should never have been used to push unpopular things or un-Catholic things and politically. He's correct. I think sometimes the, say, abuse of the liturgy from what we call the Vatican II Mass, again, calls it the Vatican II Mass. was not helpful for people who were looking for a deeper experience of prayer, of contact with the mystery of faith that they seemed to find in the celebration of the Tridentine Mass. Let's pause there for a second. He talks about the depth of the experience of prayer and the experience of the liturgy. Okay. I know a lot of people are trying to paint Pope Leo as Pope Francis II, and he very well may turn out to be, although I think this document is indicative that he's probably not, at least in temperament and approach, because he seems to be he's being a lot more reasonable and a lot less shove it down your throat than Pope Francis was. I mean, just from a governing style alone, he seems to be different. That's just my opinion. But I think the best comparison between popes to Pope Leo is probably Cardinal Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, maybe a little bit Pope John Paul II. But really, when you look at his Cardinal Prévost stuff, his Bishop Prévost stuff from before he was Pope Leo, he's constantly referencing Ratzinger. He references other people as well, because of course they do. But he references Ratzinger a lot. Ratzinger seems to be very formative on his thinking. And what you're seeing here, in my opinion, is the influence of the philosophy of personalism when it comes to experiencing the liturgy. And I do write about personalism in my book, What Happened to Catholicism. I'll pull that up on the screen here for you. I think I will, if I can find it. There you go. What Happened to Catholicism. You can buy the link for that's underneath. And I have a section in my book on personalism, which personalists will probably disagree with, but I address that in the book, that personalists could agree or disagree with me because the philosophy allows itself to play both sides. Because, why? Because it basically begins with experience. So depending on how one experiences my argument, they can come to a different conclusion. Now, let's give the benefit of the doubt here. You know, there is a very strong, very formidable, he's passed away many years ago, but was a very formidable traditional Catholic scholar named Dietrich von Hildebrand, who very much was an advocate of personalism. And his personalism allowed him to arrive at the point where he was convinced that there was something defective in the new Mass. Not necessarily that it was heretical, but that there was something wrong with it in the sense of how a liturgy should be experienced. And there was another personalist named Pope John Paul II, who was very much a personalist, personalist par excellence, who had the opposite opinion. And why was that the case? Here's why. Because the traditional personalist, that's a mouthful. The traditional personalist, Dietrich von Hildebrand, he was convinced that the sort of ineffable, inexplicable, mysterious, awesome nature of God was best understood in silence and in the sacredness of rites received from antiquity that are sort of imbibed with that religiosity that is very ancient. And that when you get away from that, you're not able to have a legitimate experience in the liturgy to reach the heights of contemplation and prayer that you would expect a liturgy to help you to do. I hope that I'm explaining it properly. I think I am. John Paul II, he had a greater emphasis on the communal nature of liturgy. And his notion was essentially that as the mystical body of Christ, we are saved in a communion, and therefore the more active collective participation of others in a rite that is more communal with layman and priest, it brings this strength in numbers to allow the body of Christ to ascend together up the mountain of God with something that is more human. That was kind of the idea. I hope I'm explaining that well. I think I am. Both of those arguments are perfectly acceptable to personalism. Both of them are. Both of their conclusions were radically different. Personally, I see a ton of personalism in Pope Leo because I see a ton of personalism in Pope John Paul II, and I see a ton of personalism in Cardinal Ratzinger. And Cardinal Ratzinger was very clear about his love of personalism. But then again, you see Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict in sort of different streams as far as how they approach the liturgy. Why? Because personalism allows that. one of my critiques in my book, and again, I know that there are very smart personalists out there. I'm not trying to do the debunking personalism thing, because that's something that academics have to do properly. This is just a podcast, so don't go crazy if you're one of those guys. But one of my critiques in my book is essentially that while you could totally make the argument, if we're giving benefit of the doubt, that you could use personalism for Catholic theology, the problem is that, at least in my opinion, it's too easily co-opted to make very contradictory arguments. And that's an issue. Whereas when you look at something like scholastic philosophy, even though certainly one could be a bad Thomist, 100%, we have an objective standard to say this Thomistic argument is wrong, whereas this Thomistic argument is correct. So when we think about, for example, the liturgy, if I was to put on my Thomist cap, and I'm not a official card-carrying Thomist, I just really like Thomas Aquinas. I'm not, a Dr. Peter Kwasniewski or something. But if I were to put on my Thomist cap, and I were to assess the liturgy as a Thomist, I would begin with objective criteria that would each have to basically be proved to their logical conclusion to assess what the liturgy is for, why it exists, how it should be done, and the role experience should play, and so on and so on and so on and so forth, to make sure that we have the most adequate theological expression and taking into account the role of the experience of the person coming into it, which in Thomism would certainly not be primary, but would be a consideration nonetheless. And you could have a very, sink your teeth into it, black and white presentation of why one liturgy ought to be promoted versus another. And I think that's why, you see these traditional Thomist types, and they never come down on the side of the Novus Ordo, because it can't pass the test. Whereas with personalism, you can make some more ethereal arguments, and I think that's fair to say. All right, we'll stop with our personalism, Thomism, liturgy digression, but I hope that helps to explain. Again, we're looking at what Pope Leo is saying. We're trying to figure out what kind of man he is and what kind of theology he has, and I think it's important to make the distinctions. Again, it's not helpful, in my opinion, to just slam him as Francis II as if they're the same kind of person. I just don't think they are. It doesn't mean Pope Leo is going to be much better as far as what happens. Could be worse. I don't know. It's just getting it right, I think, is important. Okay, back to what he said. Okay, so he talked about the contact with the mystery of faith that they seem to find in the celebration of the Tridentine Mass. He says, again, we've become polarized with that. Instead of being able to say, well, if we celebrate the Vatican II liturgy in a proper way, do you really find that much difference between this experience and that experience? That's a good question to ask. It's a good question to ask. And Eric Sammons, our friend Eric Sammons at Crisis Magazine, he responded to this and he said, I've regularly attended both a Unicorn Novus Ordo and the TLM. The experiences are significantly different. And, if we're going on experience, that's the opinion of Eric Sammons. I've never attended a Unicorn Novus Ordo. The closest I ever attended was, I guess the closest I ever attended was back when I was sort of discovering Catholic tradition, and I was at a retreat. It was not a traditional retreat, although it was pretty good as far as the theology and the conferences, and it was silent and all that. It was spiritually helpful. And the Mass was celebrated in a more traditional way, the Roman canon, I think. The priest, you could tell he had said the Latin Mass, sacred digits and stuff. He held things properly. And certainly, was it a step up as far as the atmosphere of my local parish Novus Ordo? 1,000%. At the same time, once you become imbibed with the traditional Mass, and once you read about it and learn about it, you just can't help but see the differences and blind spots, deficiencies, whatever you want to call it, problems. And that makes an experience that is, let's say, a free experience, a liberating experience, where you can sort of just let your guard down. That makes that basically impossible. So I think Eric is correct there. He continues, he says, I have not had the chance to really sit down with a group of people who are advocating for the Tridentine Rite. That's a positive statement for him. He's putting it out there and he's saying, I haven't had the opportunity to sit there and listen to them. Okay, well, that implies that he's open to listening to them. That's a good thing. There's an opportunity coming up soon, and I'm sure there will be occasions for that. I believe he's talking about the Summorum Pontificum pilgrimage, if I'm not mistaken. But that is an issue that I think also maybe with synodality, we have to sit down and talk about it. I did a video a little while back. I'll see if I can find it. I don't usually do prediction videos, but it was not long after Pope Leo was elected. And I think I called it prediction or something like that. Let me bring it up here. Oh yeah, here it is. It's back when I was in my basement studio. And it was called Prediction. Pope Leo will restore the Latin Mass. Here's how he will do it. What did I say in that video? Well, you can see it's on my channel. It's about 3 months old, I guess, just around the time that he was elected. Here it is down there. Anyway, what did I say in that? I basically said, listen, Pope Leo is inheriting a very fractured church. Nobody wants that job. You can think the worst you want about Pope Leo, but he's like a human being who has to live with himself, and he's got like 20 years of this staring him in the face. Because he's 70, right? He's healthy. He could get sick or something, but he's probably going to be Pope for 15 to 20 years. People were not happy under Pope Francis, except for the most kind of wacky ideologues. No one likes to live in a state of constant tension. So he's going to have to try to deal with these things. Does he want to create a Western schism situation? I don't think that anyone wants that, just being honest. So he's going to have to deal with it. So my prediction was basically, I bet you he's going to do something like appeal to synodality in order to find a way forward. And what does that mean? Well, we can look at more of what he said, because he kind of gives a little insight into that. All right, so what does he say? Oh, that's still the same one. I'll open up the article again, or the transcript, or the piece of the interview. He says, it's become the kind of issue, he says, maybe with synodality, we have to sit down and talk about it. It's become the kind of issue that's so polarized that people aren't willing to listen to one another oftentimes. I've heard bishops talk to me, they've talked to me about that, where they say, we've invited them to this and that, and they just won't even hear it. They don't even want to talk about it. That's a problem itself. It means we're into ideology now. We're no longer into the experience of communion, of church communion. Anyway, that's it's from Crux. So he talks about synodality. He talks about wanting to sit down and sort of hear the other side and so on and so forth. This is all very Ratzingerian. Pope Francis, as we saw, God rest his soul, after he passed away, he didn't care what the other side had to say. He didn't even pretend to care. He just sort of ridiculed the other side. Pope Leo is saying, hey, listen, I've never sat down with traditionalists. I've never had the opportunity to do so. I've been told this, but now it sounds like we're an ideology, so we kind of have to sit together and we have to find out some sort of synodal way. That's what I believed would happen. That's what I said, 3 months ago, not long after he was elected, because, quite frankly, here's the thing you have to understand about how the papacy works. The papacy is not American politics. It's not a parliament. It's not a Congress. It's not supposed to function like that. The idea that you govern with executive order or votes on this and that, and things change with the winds of time, this is not how the church is supposed to operate. If you look at take a look, for example, at Pope Benedict's papacy. He didn't do anything about the Latin Mass for 2 years. Pope Benedict knew a lot about the problems with Latin Mass. He was the go-to between Pope John Paul II and Archbishop Lefebvre. He understood very well, and he laid in waiting, and he found a way over a long period of time, 2 years into his pontificate, to finally liberate it, then sort of deal with the SSPX in a more direct way and blah, blah, blah. It's only been 4 months. You know, the way that I think, you know, we use this expression TikTok brain. People just don't have attention spans. I think we need to use another expression and say something like, you know, people have politics brain. The church is not supposed to operate the way that our political institutions have become accustomed to operating. The conciliar revolution was a very unique and awful chastisement-like period in the church. The changes that took place, the recovation of the liturgy, all these things. Even if you're someone who thinks that Vatican II was the best thing since sliced bread, just from a perspective of thinking like a Catholic, you have to admit that the way all of that stuff has been done is so un-Catholic. It's not the way the church operates. I mean, the heresy of Lutheranism begins 1517. Protestantism, you know, becomes a big deal after that. We don't even have the conclusion of the council dealing with Lutheranism for 50 years. You know, Pope Pius X, he's elected in 1903. He certainly understood modernism. Pope Leo XIII was writing about modernism under different names, you know, talking about modern philosophy and liberalism. Pius IX before him and all the popes in the 18th and 19th century were dealing with it. It takes Pius X 4 years to finally come out with his official condemnation of modernism and to excommunicate the various heretics. And Pius X is seen as a pope who really did stuff. That was one thing as a bishop he was known for, is he was known for his Catholic action. He was known for getting to work, getting down to business, and making things happen. It took him 4 years to excommunicate a bunch of heretics that were running around that everyone knew were heretics. Things are not within the church. Our leaders are supposed to keep in mind the care of souls. And whether you like it or not, and heaven knows I don't like the new Mass. Heaven knows I'm not the biggest fan of Vatican II. I'm not a big post-conciliar guy. Might be shocked to hear that. You probably have gathered that. But if I were elected Pope tomorrow, and I had to consider the billions of souls, the idea that the Pope is going to, with a stroke of a pen, bring about this total switch in liturgical things and this total shift in governing direction and so forth, it's a fantasy. It's not going to happen. It just isn't. It's not supposed to happen. You know, when you look into Thomas Aquinas, and Thomas Aquinas talks about how legislators are supposed to operate, in both in the civil sphere and in the ecclesial sphere. Changing laws that have been established is almost never permissible, unless there is a grave need, and the need is so great that the collateral damage from changing the law will be less than the good achieved by the change. So this is why what happened after Vatican II with liturgy, totally illegitimate from a moral perspective. It just is. It was totally illegitimate. But it happened. Now it's become the custom. Now the vast majority of Catholics around the world are used to the new Mass. They just are. Now, most Catholics around the world don't go to Mass. I mean, North America Mass attendance is what, 17, 18% if we're being generous. It's less in Western Europe. Okay, in Africa it's higher, whatever. But let's say around the world it's somewhere around 30%. That's probably a good average if we have high estimates in some places and the lowest estimates in other places. somewhere around 30% of Catholics that attend Mass weekly, out of the, 95% or so of that 30%, at least in the Roman rite, in the Latin rite, they attend the new Mass. That's just a fact. It shouldn't have happened. It wasn't done right. We could sit here and debate about, how the new Mass, whatever, fine, but it happened. On the other hand, Pope Leo, if we could use another historical parallel, you've heard the myth of Pope Pius XII being Hitler's pope. Sorry, I'm sweating because I don't have any air conditioning and it's a hot day in September here. You've heard the myth of Pius XII being Hitler's pope. Where does that myth come from? Well, there's actually there was a Soviet play, like a play of theater that was put together. But besides that, one of the reasons why that myth caught on was because in the beginning of the rise of the various political ideologies in the 30s and whatever, there was a lot of condemnation coming forth from both Pius XI and early on from Pius XII. And it was the bishops it was either the Netherlands or Belgium, either way. They basically told the Vatican, you need to stop. Not that you're wrong, but every time you come out with one of your condemnations of these errors that are anti-Catholic of our governing, authorities, they basically come into our churches and round us up and beat us with sticks. So there was a prudential decision that for the good of the souls, for the good of the faithful, we got to sort of approach this a different way. And Pius XII understood that, so he sought other ways to try to deal with the National Socialist problem and so forth. So sometimes his enemies would accuse him of being too quiet. But there was a reason why he wasn't speaking out as strongly as some would have liked him to, because he's in charge and he's realizing what is happening. He's getting the cries of the orphans and the widows from the persecutions they're going, and he's saying, how do I balance that? He's being a father. Similarly, whatever Leo's intentions may be, he knows who his confreres are. He knows a lot of the world's bishops. He knows their personalities. He knows that he has to be very delicate with this from a perspective of trying to keep as much peace as is possible. And that's an unfortunate reality that we have to contend with. As much as we all dislike the various Cardinal Supiches of the world and how awful they've been in so many ways, they're in charge of a lot of places. And Leo has to deal with them as much as he has to deal with the, Bishop Schneiders and the Cardinal Burkes of the world. He's got a very dysfunctional family. So if he has any good intentions, and I would like to hope he does, if he does desire for there to be an integration of Catholics who have otherwise been, thrown by the wayside, if he wants to try to find a way to pull those traditionalists out of those school gyms and put them back in parishes where they belong, he has to deal with the Bishop of Charlotte, who's been nuts about the traditional Mass and the way he's treating traditionalists recently, as much as he has to deal with Bishop Schneider. And that's his job. So he's going to take a while, and he's going to try to do it in the best way that he can. And again, that might be frustrating to people, and I'm not saying he's going to make the right decision. He might make a terrible decision. I don't know. But if you're a traditionalist who is struggling out there because your Mass has been ripped away and so forth, and it's many of you I find in my comments, and it's absolutely tragic. If that's your reality, that's awful. It's not fair. It's wrong. The traditional Latin Mass is your right. We hear this term rights so often, civil rights, this and that, and it's just a bunch of leftist nonsense at this point. Like, my right to do whatever I want. Well, no, you have only rights that are attached to duties. You have a duty to worship God in the right way. Therefore, you have a right to go to the Mass that ticks the necessary boxes. And the traditional Mass does that. The new Mass does not. Validity of the consecration of the Eucharist notwithstanding. There's more to a Mass than just the Holy Eucharist. If it was just about the Holy Eucharist, then we may as well have drive-thrus where we take Holy Communion because all that's needed is a consecration. It's a stupid argument and people just say it's valid. I can't believe people even get away with that anymore. May as well just have a Mass on the back of a pickup truck. Priest says the words of consecration. We take Holy Communion. Who cares, bro? It's valid. Anyway, your situation, if you're a traditionalist who's had it ripped away from you, is absolutely tragic. And he has to deal with that. The situation of Catholics who have been malformed and who are integrated into their parishes, and they have all these things going on, and yeah, it's looking pretty modernist, but they're part of it and it's their thing. That's also their reality. And he has to deal with that. How he finds a way forward, I think I would never want to have that job. But from what we can tell from his statements, and he's starting to say more now, from what we can tell, he wants to sit down with supporters of the traditional Mass, and he wants to hear what they have to say, and he wants to find some sort of communal way, some synodal way. Is it going to be kind of cringe? Probably. Could there be a backhanded thing there where, hey, I'll give you guys the liberation of your Latin Mass, but I expect to see you at the Chrism Mass concelebrating Fraternity Institute and so forth. Could that be the way it is? Maybe. I don't know. Maybe he will say, basically, we've consulted, blah, 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 talked to the bishops, this and that. We've heard the cries of the faithful, da, 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 da. We are now sort of rolling back some of the restrictions, and, every bishop in the world can basically do as they see fit in our diocese and blah, 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 and their diocese and blah, 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 blah. Will that fix the most insane diocese? No, it won't in the short term. In the long term, it kind of will. Why? Well, for a couple reasons. Very practical. On the one hand, sometimes you have dioceses that are not that far from each other. So you'll just drive to a different one, and all of a sudden, a lot of their churches are more empty than they were, and they make less money. And they go, where have my Catholics gone? Oh, they're at the next diocese. Okay. Secondly, whenever a new document comes out, whenever a new way of doing stuff comes out, that becomes the precedent, and the old one is kind of gone. When Traditionis Custodes came out, you could no longer appeal to Summorum Pontificum. Unfortunately, for many. When Summorum Pontificum came out, you could no longer appeal to, what's it called? Quatior abinc annos from, that's a different one. Am I right? Anyway, the one from 1984 about the indult. I'm getting the name wrong, I think. It doesn't matter. The bishops that read that one in 1984 and decided not to allow priests to say the traditional Latin Mass because you could interpret the document that way, they couldn't appeal to that anymore because now there was a new one from Pope Benedict. We're dealing with anarchy and chaos in the church, and Pope Leo is going to have to deal with that. He might do a terrible job. He might not. And it sounds like he wants to sit down with traditionalists and try to find a way to be a little bit more synodal. I can't stand the synod on synodality. I think it's dumb. It's basically modernism. It is modernism. But Pius X did tell us, and I'll show you this actually from Pascendi. He did tell us that modernists often are fans of traditional rites. I'm paraphrasing, but I'll show you. Here is paragraph 38 from Pascendi, and this is when he talks about modernists as reformers. Read this paragraph because he's basically talking about the Second Vatican Council before it happened. In any case, he says, Regarding worship, the number of external devotions is to be reduced, or at least steps must be taken to prevent their further increase. So modernists will want to get rid of a lot of the rites and simplify things and decrease them and so forth, and that's what happened. He said, though indeed some of the admirers of symbolism are disposed to be more indulgent on this head. What does he mean there? What he's saying is, in general, modernists will want to smash down all of the traditional ways of doing the liturgy and piety because it's too primitive, it's too superstitious, whatever. They'll find their reasons. Although some of them who put a greater weight on symbolism will be more indulgent, meaning there are modernists who, for reasons of experience and reasons of nostalgia and their aesthetic tastes and so forth, actually might want to promote the more traditional rites. This is what makes modernism so difficult. So we see here in Pope Leo talking about how he's all worried about the experiences people are having. The man could be imbibed with modernism, which I would have to say partly seems likely given how he speaks. At the same time, that doesn't mean that he's going to want to take away your traditional mass and not want to give it to you, because modernists go both ways on that, not for the right reasons, but they do. So I still believe that due to this whole synodal process and the whole mentality of Pope Leo that is very Ratzingerian, I do believe that there is a good chance that it'll take a little while, because everything takes a little while. But I do believe there will be some movement on that, if I'm being honest. I don't know what it's going to look like. It does seem like he's taking it seriously, so pray for that. Pray for it. Now, I think that's all I have to say. I was going to say something else, but I'll save it for another day. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's all I have for you. God bless you all. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.